Hey everybody, how we doing? See if we can get Eric on the call here. Every time we do this, we usually goof up. Oh, wow, first shot. This is amazing.
Yes, we're getting this down.
It's funny because I do the same thing every single time, and today it just worked. So we're gonna let you guys hop on. Everyone's gonna be joining us here in a little bit. So today we're gonna be talking about training consideration for runners, and running is interesting because it's one of those scenarios that people just do naturally. They get up, and if you have to run, you have to get away from something, you have to run, and then you've got the other end of the extreme where people are doing marathons and marathons, etc. But we know this as strength and conditioning coaches. When you work with runners, let's just say runners tend to be very committed to running, and to get them to not run, it usually is going to take some sort of hostage situation to make it happen. So Eric, what is your experience in general working with runners?
Well, first, we probably should define what we mean by runners. Like that comes in all different categories, right? I have 100-meter sprinters, and we have people who do, ultra marathons, right? And there's everything in between. So you have to kind of look at what that means, and then, like you said, it's okay. Now they're going to run. Are we running for enjoyment? Are we running for sport? And if that is a sport, then what is the event going to be? Is it going to be the next 5K? Is the event going to be, I'm running at we just had the Penn Relays that's down by us, which is a huge national event for track athletes. Is it running because I want to change my body composition? I think that's the vehicle to get me there. So we have to kind of clarify that first, because it's very different in terms of how we're going to prepare you on all different sides of things, in terms of from a structural component, right? From a training component in the weight room, right? One person needs a lot more twitch, and the other person needs a lot more ability to sustain. From a physiological component, where are we going to be working in terms of your training zones, and where are we going to be working in terms of energy systems? That's going to all have a thing. And then in terms of programming, which is what we talk about, is okay, well, how much do I need to do, for how long, for how hard do I need to go? We have to answer all those questions based on some boxes that they're going to check. And basically, like in the course we talk about, right, we have our checklist of 10 programming elements, and we break those 10 into 3 groups. The first group is determined by the organism. That's the person who walks in your door, and so they're going to pick those things. We don't get to pick. We don't have a person walk through our door and say, hey, you're going to be a 5K runner, right? This isn't the old Soviet bloc where you pull them out in elementary school and say, hey, you're going to be a sprinter in high school. So we don't get to pick that stuff. And then the stuff we get to pick, that's the environment. We get to pick what are they going to do, when are they going to do it, how much are they going to do. And then we're doing that based on a set of rules that's set by nature, by science. And so we know that going out and running 10, 15, 20 miles may not be the best recipe for the 100-meter sprinter. And it may not be the best recipe for someone to change their body composition.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to running, we absolutely have to specify, because like you said, we've got sort of sprinting on one end of the continuum, which 100-meter sprinter in the Olympics is sub 10 seconds, and then again, ultra marathons are just hours and hours and hours. So I think specificity is absolutely important. But I think that there's a few things we can agree on, regardless of what they're doing, is movement health, and trying to get your athletes to be as durable as possible. We met through obviously teaching with FMS, and we understand the importance of movement quality. But at the same time, depending on what the athlete's doing, you're going to actually need to program a little bit more in one direction or another. So for example, let's just take someone that's going to do a little bit of like mid-distance stuff, 10Ks, right? Or even 5Ks. If you kind of look at the gait when it comes to running versus sprinting, I would say the one thing people don't really think about is relative hip extension. So when you're sprinting and you're really going top end, you're utilizing as much hip extension as possible. That helps in obviously stride length, helps with the propulsion phase as you push through the ground, etc. But it's one of those things, when you are sprinting, we tend to get a lot more hip extension in general, which, if you train sprinters and athletes that require top speed work, you need to be able to access that posterior chain and obviously build that posterior chain, because that really, really is your engine. So that's one of the things I think right away people don't even think of is, regardless of the movement standpoint, ankles, hips, etc., what are the repetitive patterns within each, we'll call it an event, right? I mean, the mechanics, when someone runs a 5K or a 10K, it's very, very different than 100 meters. So I think if we just step back and look at the sort of global mechanics and what people are asking of their bodies, I think that's going to obviously, not obviously, but for some people, give us some sort of consideration as to what we need to focus on from a training standpoint.
So, I tell everybody there's three basic things that make up how fast you're going to get from point A to point B, whether that's from a starting block to a finish line 100 meters away, whether it's from one end zone to the other on a football field, whether it's from the starting gun to around a city 26 miles later, is you have your stride length, like how far apart are your feet when they actually touch the ground. And that's how Usain Bolt I think he's about 6'4", right? He's going to get there a lot faster than I am at 5'6", just by pure stride length, is going to be a huge advantage to him. So how far apart your feet are. Now, as you just mentioned, your stride length is naturally going to be longer sprinting than it's going to be jogging, right? And then that transition is just going to open that up. So you have your stride length. Then the next thing is your stride frequency, how quickly you pick them up and put them down. And that's your rate of force production, which is how quickly you can access your muscles. It has a little bit to do with your DNA and who your parents were. And so that's a factor. And then once you hit the ground is how well you absorb that force into the ground. You can recycle it, and how much force you put into the ground to now pull the ground underneath you, and push the ground behind you. All those three things are factors. So how do we get to all those? Well, stride length, don't go out and try to increase your stride length by reaching further. That's the surest way to heel strike, which is just going to beat the hell out of everything up the chain. So we naturally need to improve our stride length by getting better control of the pelvis. And so, you mentioned the FMS. One of the things we'll look at is your active straight leg raise. We'll look at your ability to get hip extension, to be able to differ, not just how much you can lift your leg or how much you can extend your leg, but how much can you do it without taking the pelvis with you, right? And dumping it and tilting it under. So that's how we're going to look at stride length as one of our first things. And it's not always by, at the park, before I'm going to go run around the track, I'm going to throw my foot up on the top of the fence and I'm going to put my nose to my knee, and that's going to improve my stride length, because that's naive range of motion. It's not range of motion you can control. So that's the first box in terms of stride length and how we consider those things. So now stride frequency, that's a matter of just creating some twitch. Now, even if you're a distance runner, when I say distance, you're doing miles or more, right? We're not a short sprint type athlete. You still need to be able to have a little bit of frequency, and you need to have a little bit of twitch and elasticity. And so one of the things that, especially as you get, because a lot of times we see recreational runners who are 40, 50, 60 years old, and from a structural standpoint, their Achilles gets some of the worst blood flow in the body. And that's why, there's countless stories of beer league softball, mayhem when Achilles get blown out, because you're asking that thing to put force through it, then it just goes. So things like jumping rope, right, is just a really good basic way to maintain some elasticity and some spring in the ankle. So in addition to the hip mobility, we have to look at the ankle and the foot, making sure we have good mobility through that. And then how much force you put in the ground, how much you absorb, the importance of deceleration, learning how to decelerate and manage and self-organize your body, as well as having some strength, right? If you don't put any force into the ground, you're not going to get anywhere. So I'm gonna shift gears a little bit and say, okay, well, now conditioning and using running as a conditioning tool. Like, I didn't even bring that up, but like, you've worked with fighters, and the big thing with fighters is road work. I'm gonna go out and put my hood up, and I'm gonna run through the market, right, and up the stairs, and the whole neighborhood follows me, right? That's how your fighters all train.
Just identical to Rocky. You are
Yeah.
They all have a matching gray sweatsuit as
The
well.
outfit, yeah.
So I'll be honest with you. I don't recommend long distance running or even steady state running to really any of my clients. And here's why. most fighters are crappy runners. They're just, they don't move well in general. And when I say move well, I'm not saying that they don't have flexibility, mobility. It's just from a running mechanic standpoint, the amount of time it would take me to improve the running mechanics to get the actual adaptation that we're trying to get. There's other things we could do, and it is also just a little bit of unnecessary wear and tear on their body, right? Especially if they don't run properly. So, and one of the things that I really try to focus on is when I'm programming it, to me, it's about the adaptation. That's really the end result. And there are a few different ways to get aerobic adaptations, but in general, for my clients, especially my fighters, I really don't have them run simply because, again, most of the time they don't run well, or they've just, they've got a grumpy knee or a grumpy ankle or grumpy hip. So it's usually last on the list. But with that being said, I do have a couple of my athletes, and we use a true form runner, which is just a curved treadmill. It's a little bit easier on the body, and because of the shape of the curved treadmill, it actually improves the foot strike a little bit. I've got 2 to 3 of my athletes that will actually do one day on the treadmill, and we'll base that off their maximum aerobic speed, and we actually have parameters on what we're trying to do. But for the most part, it's just simply not the best choice for them, and it's just because of more about the wear and tear on the body, because there's so much with wrestling and jiu-jitsu and striking and Muay Thai, these guys are just beat up to begin with. So I'm not against it. I'm just against it based off of, the clients and what they need.
So you touch on something in terms of like the relative intensity, right? So we have, people depending on what you eat, whether you get on your Peloton or whether you look at the more traditional exercise science models, we have these different zones, which is zone 1 is just a casual walk. And then zone 2 is considered just below, just at the top of a conversational pace. And that has gotten a lot of press as of late, and the values of zone 2 and how important that is, and how much of that your training it should be. And, people like Andrew Huberman will say you should get somewhere between 150 to 180 minutes of that per week. Peter Attia goes into great depth in terms of zone 2 training. Alex Vaeda does a great job of explaining. I think it was on Jordan Syatt's podcast about zone 2. But then there's also those upper zones where we're pushing into max heart rate. So your long distance runners, do they need to get to those higher ends? Yeah, it just doesn't need to be as much of their training. And if you look at, if you read a great book called Endure by Alex Hutchinson, he talks about, looking at Kenyan runners are running at a very low percentage of their max when in the bulk of their training. The difference is that elite Kenyan runners, their low percentage would be like my heart pounding through my chest, heaving pace. But for them, it's relatively low. And for them, it's shockingly easy. And he said, he tells a story in there when he was at Duke studying them. He said he would see them out on the trails and they would be moving, but having a really easy conversation, like joking and laughing. So you could tell that was an easy pace for them. Now you could use this through heart rate monitoring. I like to go a little bit deeper to look at your readiness and tying that in using like the Morpheus strap. Joel Jamieson does some great stuff with that. But understanding that for the runner that wants to win the next 5K, going out and just running 5K as fast as you can every day is maybe the worst formula you could do to get there. And so learning how to play those notes of I'm going to go, today's a super easy day. I'm just going to work on mechanics and I'm going to judge it based on heart rate or my breath or based on my conversational level. And then some days I'm going to go and I'm going to do, 400 meter repeats. And it's going to be probably a lot less distance covered than I'm going to in my race, but that's going to add up in terms of your ability to have the top end tolerance. And for heart health, one's going to work more on strengthening the walls of the heart so it can pump more, and then the other one's going to work on just more blood volume, right? So tell me a little bit, because I know you go real in depth, and I know you've looked at some really good stuff with, I think it's Dan Baker's work you've done a lot with, right, with conditioning stuff.
Yeah, so I use, I've got kind of, I've been reading, the stuff that I use is actually probably a combination of stuff I learned from Dan Baker, from Joel Jamieson, Carmen Bott, who's another brilliant professor up in the Canada area. And what I do is, depending on the athlete, I have them do a baseline assessment. And this is for MMA. way. So if this is for, someone looking to do a half marathon, it'd be very, very different. But we either use the bike or the treadmill to look at their maximum aerobic speed, right? And from that assessment, we get a couple different things. On the bike, we're really looking for their average wattage. And then on a treadmill, it's sort of the average miles per hour, right? And then from there, depending on how many days a week we're going to be working with the athletes, we'll actually break down some high intensity days, some sort of and lower intensity days, or something right down the middle. So on one day, we may be working 120% of that number for X amount of time. And another day, we may be working at 90% of that number for X amount of time. So we tend to use a high and low method based off of the adaptations that we're looking to get. But here's what it boils down to is, if you are getting to the point, I mean, every once in a while, you do need to start running and sprinting. Absolutely, just going out there and motoring it, and forget about having parameters, right? But when you are trying to dial in an athlete, you want to have certain metrics and guidelines for them to hit. So like for a lot of my athletes, if I know they're 100% of their maximum aerobic speed, if I know that number, I'm going to start them off at their camp at doing multiple repeats of 90% or 92%. And depending on what the adaptations that we're trying to get, we'll have to change those parameters based on how many weeks we have for a fight camp. So, but the whole idea of this is just proper stress and adaptation, right? And if you don't have some sort of metric from some sort of standpoint, then how can you dial in what their true max is and what their low is? So it just gives us some guardrails to use, and the data doesn't lie. And also, if the client comes in and they're dogging it, it's like, listen, we know what you're capable of. These are your numbers that you have to hit. So the beauty of it is you're not necessarily only held accountable by the coach. You're actually held accountable by the data and the metrics, because we know that you are capable at performing at a certain level. And yes, I get it. Some days we're tired, some days we're not feeling well, but you know what? I mean, if you want to be a high level athlete, sometimes you just have to say, you know what, you got to suck it up a little bit and put the work in.
Yeah, so there are a couple things you touch on. Is one is, if I'm training runners, and people always ask us, like, what's the best exercise in the gym for runners? And strength, and we can come back to this, strength is an important component, and there are things that I would want to emphasize. But ultimately, to get good at running, you're going to have to do some running, and that's relative to whatever we talk about in the course. It's relative to your training age. I don't have to have my guy who's an avid runner who's 62 and who's done multiple marathons and put in endless miles. I don't have to have him do nearly as much running as I do someone who doesn't have that accumulated training age. But then the other thing you talked about is efficiency and economy. Now let's come back and talk about economy of movement, but let's talk about economy of your physiology. And another guy that if you're a runner and you're not following Dr. Phil Maffetone, you need to follow him. And I know Gray Cook, who's a friend of ours, is one of our mentors, talks a lot about it. And the method is his Maffetone aerobic formula is, if you take 180 minus your age, right, that roughly that heart rate, and he has some variables in there that if you're super fit, you would bump that up by 5 to 10. If you're not, you drop it down by 5 to 10. And then obviously you can counter in for your daily readiness. But whatever you can do at that heart rate. So let's say you go out and you're going to do your, today you're going to get however much road work. You're supposed to get 5 miles. But you have to keep it at that, for easy math, let's say you have to be at 130 beats per minute on your monitor. Now, for some of you, it's going to be a very humblingly slow pace. But what you notice is let's say you do that now, that 5 miles in whatever time it takes you. Let's say it takes you 40 minutes. Now, if as you do that, and if that's going to be part of your low intensity work, if you can now do that next time at the same heart rate and you get it done in 38 minutes, you're now more economical, you're more efficient. So when nothing is going to mimic competition day, when the adrenaline kicks in and the gun goes off. So if you can just get more economical, that means you're going to expend less energy at lower parts, and you have more reserve when you do want to put the pedal down for that final kick. So being able to use that is a huge formula for people to use in terms of, can I get more done in the same amount of time, or can I get more done at staying at the same relative level of intensity? Then there's the economy of your movement. So like you started to touch on it before, but like talk about like when you're watching someone run and you can see, well, wow, he or she's just leaking energy all over the place. Like what are some of the telltale signs you see?
So a lot of the times if people run and there's no natural torso rotation, like you'll see a good runner, they'll have sort of a nice sort of reciprocal movement and it tends to flow. It tends to look athletic. A lot of times you see people in their run and their torso is stiff and they kind of run like this. They kind of run like Forrest Gump a little bit, if you're from being honest, right? One of those things that looks naturally stiff. Another one that you tend to see is a lot of times, and you'll see when they run, what their pelvis does. And this is usually a little bit more apparent in females. If you're on the catwalk and you're doing your thing, it's a little bit different, right? You want those hips to move. That they're doing that for a reason. But if you're running and you're trying to teach the body how to manage force through the ground, through your extremities, through your pelvis, and through your torso, because there is this opposing limb reciprocation that we have to really think about. You have to have some pelvic stability there. And that's another thing. So if we see this big clunk, 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 clunk side to side going on, we can assume that there's a bunch of instability going on in that pelvis. And, get ready for a spondy, get ready for a sore low back. And then I would say the other thing is just looking at heel striking in general. Now, here's the thing, some people can get away their entire life with heel striking. Some people, it's really, really bad, and it's gonna definitely create some issues. I mean, if you look at some of the running shoes out there, you can buy running shoes that literally have 2.5 inches of padding, and really that's the whole point, guys, of a big elevated, big cushy shoe. By the way, it's so you can get away with heel striking. That's why it's there. There's no other reason to have a big giant heel on your shoe unless you want to run, but you don't care about your mechanics. You just care about running for whatever reasons. So the problem is that these running shoes, right? I know I'm going on a tangent here, but these running shoes are actually not giving the feedback that we need to improve our foot mechanics, right? And then on the other end, you've got, the Vibram craze, where those started going there, and everybody and their brother got Vibrams and started doing barefoot running, and then they got stress fractures and they got compartment syndrome because they decided, hey, I did 5 miles with my cushy heel shoes, and now I'm going to try to do 5 miles with my Vibrams, and they can't walk for a week. But I am not the gait guy, right? I don't sit there and I can't really break down someone's gait super, super in depth. I know enough to be dangerous, and I know enough to look at the big stuff. But those are the things that I tend to look at when it comes to running mechanics in general.
Yeah, I was going to get to footwear, and then obviously that's your main piece of equipment, right, as a runner. And so having proper footwear is extremely important, making sure you get fitted by somebody who knows what they're doing. And then the other thing, when you have that big cushiony bag of marshmallows under your foot, is that when your foot hits the ground, that lack of stability that you have, how that's going to feed up the chain, whether it's just at best just some inefficiency, or at worst, now that's going to create stress all the way up. And then if you are going to move towards a more natural running, how you're going to progress that. You can't just go out and say, I'm going to just take the shoes off and I'm going to run, like a Kenyan, if you've been in wearing Nike Boings or some marshmallows under your feet the whole time. So you need to gradually do that. And the easiest way to do that is just transition on grass. And, like a lot of my high school teams, when we're working with the track teams, as much as we can get them on grass or turf, it's a lot easier on it from the pounding standpoint to not always be on the track or doing road work. And then something I kind of, coined and came up with for myself as a teaching tool with my athletes. Now I'm working mostly with field athletes. So we're not talking about runners, but you can really take the concept and apply it to runners just at different scales and levels. Is I say we have 3 springs. Okay. That's how we absorb force, right? So like in the foot, your arch serves as a parachute when you land that absorbs the force as you land. And if it absorbs it well, it kind of it dissipates that force up through the chain like spokes on a bicycle wheel would. And it doesn't just continue to collapse and go valgus and then everything on the chain goes down with it. So it's a parachute on the way down, but then that spring is what launches us into the next stride. And so one of the flaws that I can not necessarily look for, is not the right term, is you can listen. When you hear that person on the treadmill and it sounds like the circus is in town and the elephants are running through, then that's just really all that energy is getting lost into the ground. And so they don't have really good springiness. So the first spring is that foot and ankle. And can they absorb and spring? And it looks like they kind of float over the ground. They glide. The second spring is at the hip and being able to absorb through the hip. And that's how you control that pelvis, right? And it's not dumping front and back or side to side or spinning side to side. We always joke we talk about rotary stability in FMS courses. You see that person who swivels side to side when they run and they go, 6 miles sideways and 1 mile forward. And then the last spring, that the really underappreciated part, I think, that people don't get is how much the arms are a hugely important driver for any type of runner. And when you have this slumped over posture and you're just really flailing your hands, or I have one guy that runs in my neighborhood like a pirate and he just does these big cross arm swings, you're really losing them, giving away a lot of energy there. And so be able to control specifically the posterior chain, the upper part of the posterior chain, like your upper back, and be able to control your scapula and be able to have nice, good fluid arm swing. Now that arm swing changes for 100-meter field athlete versus a 100-meter sprinter versus a marathon runner. I'm not going to teach them all the same arm swing, but there needs to be something in the upper body that creates that fluidness. And that needs to be happening where we're getting T-spine extension, we're getting T-spine rotation. So it allows for this, we're getting that scapula movement and that rhythm happening, because if that's not happening, then you're losing that third sprint.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot that goes into it, but I mean, I think what it boils down to is if you kind of take a step back, right? You know, we use the idea of sort of negative space when we talk about squatting and looking at movement, much like photographers word. But like, if you just kind of step back and you watch someone run and you listen, you can learn a lot. You don't have to, you know, have a PhD in biomechanics. I mean, if it looks good and it looks effortless, it probably is. And if it looks painful and it looks labored, it probably is, right? And you know, those are, you know, obviously there's so many things to consider, like if someone's racing versus just running. But you know, I think really what it boils down to is running is a skill, and I think far too many people don't treat it that way. They just assume I could just get up and run. I mean, how many times have you seen the couch to 5K thing? And right, and when people are talking about the couch to 5K thing that gyms do, and there's nothing wrong with it, we want to encourage fitness, but the couch to 5K is never talking about stride length. They're never talking about, you know, the skill of running. It's just a basic template on how to accrue enough volume based off of, you know, your total duration to get through a 5K. They're not talking about quality of movement and movement prep and elasticity and control of the pelvis and all that other stuff. It's just a basic recipe to try to get you from nothing to a specific goal, which is a 5K. So, I mean, they're not bad things inherently, but just remember, running is a skill. And if you just think you can, you know, throw some sneaks on and go run your way to better health, some people can, but a lot of people cannot. And, you know, it's one of those things. I can't tell you how many runners I've worked with over the years that, you know, sore knees, sore hips, low back issues, sore ankles. But yet they keep doing it because it's their vice, right? And I get it. You wanna do things that'll keep you from going bananas, but at the same time, like at what cost? And we've talked about it in our course. You know, the orthopedic cost. This is something that you know, the cost of training. Eric was talking about, gosh, you know, a year and a half ago before you know, Boyle broke the internet talking about orthopedic costs. But it's the same thing, right? There's always, anytime you choose to exercise, there are pros and cons. And as long as you understand what those are going into it, I think you're going to have a much better idea of what the outcome is going to look like.
Yeah. So one big factor in that enough people don't talk about, and this is with exercise in general, but then I'm gonna to steer the ship directly at running is always breath, right? I always tell all my athletes, if they're not breathing properly, I say, all right, what's the most important thing? And they say form. I said, no. Okay, what's the most important thing? That's important, but all right. You know, you can go for weeks without food, days without water. You can only go a couple minutes without air. And so when we talk about conditioning, right, and we talk about, you know, quote unquote, your wind or your aerobic capacity, right? Well, all that is driven by your breathing. And so breathing will either ramp up or drive down your sympathetic nervous system, right? Depending on what you're exaggerating on. It's also going to have an impact on how we're converting things to energy, is driven by your breathing. So if we don't coach breathing and establish good breathing baselines and make that part of what we're coaching, you are completely missing the boat, right? So, and we know the importance of, first of all, nasal breathing, right? And as much as possible, focusing on nasal breathing and also using that as a guardrail to say, okay, if you're going out for this zone 2 run, we should be able to keep you at a nasal breathing pace. And we do a little thing, or some might some of my teams where we'll go out and I'll have them do, intervals where they can only nasal breathe, right? And I'll come back and I'll say to the team, all right, who really struggled? There's some kids that are like, they look like they're drowning. And there's other kids that are like, what was that for? Like, is that supposed to do something? Because they didn't affect them at all. And so that latter group, they're the ones who probably more naturally breathe nasally throughout the day, whereas the other group is probably more naturally mouth breathers. And that's a more habitual thing that we have to look at and establish that awareness throughout the day. Then when we look at, okay, how am I going to set my pace and use my breathing and leverage that, right? Well, it's going to be a little different if I'm doing a short sprint, but let's talk about, more distance running. Is a great way I like to coach it at a very simplistic level is a 2 to 3. At 2 to 3, we're going to inhale for 2 strides, exhale for 3 strides. What that does first is we're lengthening the exhale. Lengthening the exhale keeps you in more of a parasympathetic state. Exhalation is coupled with relaxation. And so if I inhale for 2, exhale for 3. Always inhale through the nose. You can either go back out through nose or through pursed lips. So now I set this rhythm. And again, you look at a great runner, they're rhythmic, right? They just have a good smooth rhythm to it. And that keeps you, okay, so let's say you're running and then all of a sudden that pack starts to get up next to you. And now all of a sudden it's like, you're going to change and start to get in a stress state. And now that rhythm should be set by your breathing. And so breathing is an incredibly impactful thing that we need to consider. So if you're not coaching it, you're missing a huge part of it. Then shifting gears is, we have a slide, and I forget whether it's on your section or my section in the live course, and I think it might even be in the online course as well. We have that slide. It says it's an old French proverb: if you chase 2 rabbits, you probably won't catch either of them. And so, like, I have a client that comes into mind right now. He's going to do his first Olympic distance triathlon, right, coming up. And so he's working on his swimming and his runs and his bike stuff. And so we're trying to coach him on a lot of those things. But he always says, well, it's also summer. I want to look good, right? And so those are 2 opposite ends of the continuum in terms of efficiency, right? So to be a really good endurance athlete, you have to be incredibly efficient. You should be able to go forever on nothing, on as little fuel as possible. That's economy, right? So you should be able to be that Prius that can go forever, right? Whereas on the opposite side of things, the leanest athletes in the world guzzle tons of fuel. They should be that Escalade that gets about 8 miles to the gallon. They're 2 opposite ends from a physiological standpoint. So that kind of flies in the face of, hey, I'm going to go run for fat loss. And then the second part of that is we also have to understand that your leanness, your body composition is going to impact your running performance as well, because there's a reason why marathoners look like marathoners and sprinters look like sprinters. And so all that extra muscle is going to be inefficient if I'm going to go out and try to be a distance runner. Yeah,
you just simply have to carry more weight. And, you're right. It's 2 very different opposite ends of the spectrum and 2 very, very different training modalities. And, the length of time of these events is very different as well. A sprinter, 100 meter, under 10 seconds. I think Usain Bolt even has a great quote, and it has something to do with patience, but he's like, I trained for however many years to, improve my score by 0.2 of a second. But the whole point is, people are very, very impatient. They want to get to their goals immediately. And he basically said, listen, I, trained my entire life to, shave like less than a second off of my best time ever. So, I think when you have these specific goals, whether and running is involved, it's just, you do need a plan, and you do need to consider all of the different variables like movement competency, connective tissue loading, which is something that a lot of people don't always consider. They just think, well, I'm going to develop my aerobic base. But a big part of it, if you've never ran, is just getting your connective tissue, your tendons, your ligaments adapted over time. Because if those don't adapt when they should, you're going to get overuse issues, right? Because you're basically overloading the system. So there's so many variables to consider. But regardless, you have to be efficient, and you have to be purposeful with your training. And I think one of the things that we try to cover in the course is, we always encourage people to ask more questions than they originally have anticipated, right? Asking more questions is going to give you more data. It's going to allow you to make better decisions from a programming standpoint. But when you understand what's going on in every aspect of someone's life, you can help one, yes, design a better program, but also give them the tools to manage some of these other things in their life. Like breathing, we can't walk around with our clients all day and be like, how are you breathing? How's your breathing? You just can't. So part of it is just educating your clients on, hey, pay attention to what you're doing at rest. How are you sitting? Those are all those things. And it really boils down to making them more aware, because the second they become more aware of what they're doing, that's going to give them the information that they need to start making the changes that are going to be, necessary changes if they want to reach their goals in an efficient fashion.
And all those questions we have, we're not saying we necessarily are the ones to deliver the answer, right? So as an example, is something we haven't even touched on, which is a whole nother deal, is fueling for this is incredibly important. And to the casual, the casual runner, that they think that means I'm going to eat a bowl of pasta the night before and I'm good, right? But there's a lot more to it than that. I'm actually in the middle of a great book, Peak by Dr. Mark Bubbs, talks a lot about fueling and all the different strategies that can be had, and the undulating periodization of your eating that you have to practice with, and that everybody's going to respond differently. And that's why people are sticking, CGM monitors on their arm to look at how well you react to certain things, because that goo gel that you buy at the running store is going to react different to you than it will the next person. And then speaking of that, just going online and downloading a marathon plan training or your 10K plan training, and it just gives you literally a laundry list of, day one, you run this many miles at this pace. Day two, you run this many miles at this pace. Following that and not having some adaptability in there, well, that's why we have a whole section about readiness and dynamic programming. That's why our thing's a little bit later today, because I was just on an event where I was talking about dynamic programming. How do we measure readiness beyond just a ring or a strap? How do we look at your movement readiness? How do we look at things like breath hold or grip strength or lower body motor control, things like that kind of give you a state of where you're at? Because let's say you were mapped to go in that high intensity day from the thing you downloaded off the internet for free, but you got a crappy night's sleep, you're dehydrated, and you're stressed out. Well, you're actually not going to get anything out of the training. You actually may have a net negative with that, right? And it may actually set you back in your training. And when you have a race that you're preparing for, it's no different than your fighters, right? That day is going to happen whether you're ready for it or not. And so you have to be really smart in terms of planning your training days. And so knowing your readiness and how you adapt your training off of that is incredibly important. And that's not looking at one morning's whoop reading and then like saying, oh, today I'm staying in bed today because I got a low score. Realize that that's a piece of a bigger puzzle, looking at your readiness. And that's really just more to create awareness, to say, hey, now I'm starting to realize I'm seeing a trend here, that my HRV gets lower every day, as opposed to one single drop. That's actually part of the training process. We want to have that. But to see this continual caving in of my HRV or my resting heart rates going up, that's your body's way of telling you on a global level that you're starting to overtrain. And if you're doing that going into race week, that's a problem, right? We want to peak, and there are times where we may overtrain you a little bit to get the ultimate effect down the road, but we have to know how to manage that, and managing your time and how hard to push the gas pedal is an art.
So you're trying to say we just can't throw our shoes on and go out for a run and expect to get the perfect results?
Well, it depends on what the perfect result is. If the perfect result is I need to just clear my head, right? And I'm just going to put on, I'm going to put on a podcast, or I'm going to put on music, or I'm just going to go run in the woods, and then the result is just that. It's you feel better at the end of it, and yeah, it did its job, right? It did its job. We're so caught up in the world because we deal with athletes of specificity, and there needs to be an outcome, and that outcome usually is somebody with their hand in the air, or a trophy or something, a medal happening. So there is that other side of it, that if I have someone and they come in for whatever goal and they like to run, me being a hard ass and saying, no, running isn't the right thing for you physiologically, may not be the thing, right? There's also that conscious coaching that we need to have of knowing where this fits in the grand scheme of what running is going to do for them beyond the metrics.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Man, we covered a lot. We covered a lot more than I would have thought.
This could be a whole course.
Anything else you wanna add in, Eric, before we call it a day?
No, I still got a little bit of, we you always have the course hangover the week after a course. One, because your week never ends, right? You just go from coaching people till Friday. You fly or drive to your spot. You coach, you teach all day Saturday, Sunday, and then you go right back to coaching Monday. But there's the crash and there's the little bit of high that's happening at the same time of, having that first live, PPD course was a very cool experience. We had a great group in the room. Some very inspirational people we had in our room to share ideas with, and so that was a cool thing. And so we're in the process of lining up our next live course for sometime either later this summer or early fall, or possibly even both. So stay tuned for that. And that the online course is out there. And if you're just coming to us now, we have a free teaser of the online course, so you can start to see how we go about this. Just go to principlesofprogramdesign.com, and we do this every Friday, at least for the next few weeks, but we have something special planned as this is going to transition from an Instagram live to something hopefully bigger and better.
Absolutely. So yeah, we're gonna share this here in a few minutes, and if there's any topics you guys want us to cover, please let us know. But until then, we will, Alana. We'll make sure we're on it. And you guys have a good weekend, and we'll talk to y'all soon.